and put it on the cross, and it read, Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews. Verse 20, many of the Jews read this inscription, for the place where Jesus was crucified was near the city, and it was written in Aramaic, in Latin, and in Greek. So the chief priest of the Jews said to Pilate, do not write the King of the Jews, but rather, this man said, I am King of the Jews. And Pilate answered, what I have written, I have written. In other words, he's not changing anything. We will never know if Pilate used this inscription to make sure he would not face any repercussions for having crucified a man who was clearly innocent, or if he did it out of spite for the Jews who had demanded he go against his personal judgment. And I guess it doesn't really matter why or what his motivation was, but I think the what does matter. Those who passed by read the inscription in three major languages of the day. Aramaic was the language of the local population. In doing some reading, I discovered something that I didn't realize, and that was that Hebrew was not spoken by the common man. Hebrew was a very exclusive language. As they understand it, it was only spoken by professional men of religion. Only the men who worked in the temple, only the Pharisees and the Sadducees would have been fluent in Hebrew. They are the only ones who could have read from the Hebrew scrolls, because by that time there were also scrolls in Aramaic. And so the common man, just like you and me, they would have spoken, unlike you and me, they would have spoken three languages, more than likely. Even the most uneducated of them would have been fluent in Aramaic, because that's what the common man spoke. They would have been fluent in Latin, because that was the official language of Rome. That was the Vox Romana. That was the voice of Rome, was Latin. And then almost everyone would have been fluent in Greek as well. Greek was the businessman's language. That's what all of the artisans and the tradesmen and all of those people in a public and business situation, they would have been speaking in Greek. And so Pilate, in order to make sure that everybody saw and understood what was going on, he wrote it in Aramaic, in Latin, and in Greek. It's also interesting to realize that this skull, this place of the skull where Jesus was crucified, was right next to a main thoroughfare. And so people walking by on their way to the celebration of the Passover, on their way in and out of Jerusalem, they would have walked right by these crucifixions, these public executions. The reason the Romans did that is because they wanted to be kind of an ad campaign. Don't break the rules. Don't break the rules. Which, really is the intention of capital punishment anyway. The real force of capital punishment is not to kill the criminal, but it is to persuade the future criminals that it's not worth it. And so that's what the Romans did. They portrayed and publicly displayed these who were being executed. The death and resurrection of Jesus was a message that would soon travel throughout the Middle East and ultimately around the world. And so regardless of the motivations of Pilate, the message was loud and clear. The king had died, and as we would soon learn, was raised from the dead. The king had died for his people. Verse 23. When the soldiers had crucified him, they took his garments and divided them into 4 parts, 1 part for each soldier, also his tunic. But the tunic was seamless, woven in one piece from top to bottom. And so they said to one another, let us not tear it, but cast lots for it to see whose it shall be. This was to fulfill the scripture which says, they divided my garments among them, and for my clothing they cast lots. So the soldiers did these things. It's interesting that we learn from this passage that there were actually 4 soldiers who were in charge of the crucifixion. In other words, there was a squad of 4 men whose responsibility it was to take Jesus from appearance before Pilate, make sure that he and the cross, which was more than likely just the upper part, not the pole, but the crossbeam. And I read a lot of information about how limited wood resources were. They would not have made a new cross for every person, but what they would have done more than likely is they would have left the upright in the ground, and then as a person was condemned to death, they were given their crossbeam as a way of public shame and humiliation. They had to carry their own crossbeam to the cross where they were attached to it. And so there were 4 soldiers in charge of that task of getting him to the cross, getting him attached to the cross, and then standing guard around him until he was dead. That was their charge, to make sure he died and nobody came and took him off the cross before they were dead. A perk of the gruesome responsibility were the clothes of the condemned. Again, this speaks to the callousness as well as the poverty of the soldiers. Now, I'm not above wearing a Goodwill goodie. I have a Goodwill shirt that I wear with great pride and comfort. So I'm not against wearing used clothes, but I'm going to tell you, when it comes to buying or wearing the dirty clothes of a condemned criminal, I'm probably going to let somebody else have my share, right? But that's not how they did it. There is no indication as to what these garments were except for the tunic, and so I did some reading and researching, and here's the best I could stumble on. There's no indication as to what these garments were except for the tunic, and it was the long, seamless garment worn closest to the skin. I read a little thing that said if a man was seen wearing only that tunic, he was equal to being naked. That's how they viewed that. So that was their undergarment, and it was full length and unhemmed, unseamed. It was one complete knitted, if you will, garment. The other parts would have been a belt, which was a significant part of their wardrobe. There would have been the outer tunic, so you have the inner garment, an outer garment, a belt that secured it all. And then if it was cold, and we know because Peter was warming by the fire, remember? So we know it was cold, so there was probably another garment which was referred to as the cloak, and that was the thing that kept them warm. They slept under. You remember Paul in one of his letters says, hey, how about bring my winter coat? Bring my cloak. And so that was likely and possibly one of the garments for which they were gambling. And then, of course, the sandals. If he had not been beaten out of them and lost them during the journey, they could have wanted to share those among the 4 men. Verse 24, this was to fulfill the scripture which says, they divided my garments among them, and for my clothing they cast lots. Which connects again to Psalm 22. If you've not read Psalm 22 lately, I know we did as we were studying through Psalms, but I would encourage you to go back and read Psalm 22 because it's almost a narrative to the crucifixion. The statement, my God, why have you forsaken me, which John does not record, is a direct quote of Psalm 22. So there is this real close parallel between Psalm 22 and what happened on the cross and on the hill and all that transpired there on that day. Verse 25. But standing by the cross of Jesus were his mother and his mother's sister, Mary, the wife of Clopas, and Mary Magdalene. When Jesus saw his mother and the disciple whom he loved standing nearby, he said to his mother, "Woman, behold your son." And then he said to the disciple, "Behold your mother." And from that hour, the disciple took her to his own home. First of all, the text, it seems to indicate that there were 4 women. I read about the confusion and conflict about how many women there were and how you divide it up. But it seems to me, and the majority of scholars, and among which I do not count myself, it seems that there were, in fact, 4 women standing there in support of Jesus and probably Mary. They were in support of her. They were in support of each other. They were there in support of Jesus. All 4 likely are followers of Jesus, all 4 willing to risk anything to be near their Lord. So heroic, so beautiful, so typical of women and their love and devotion. There was also the disciple whom he loved. John has such an interesting way of never referring to himself by name and yet making us very aware of the special relationship he had with Jesus. I remember reading somewhere that John might have been the youngest disciple as well as the one who outlived all the rest. The striking thing is, of course, that Jesus making sure his mother was to be cared for. Clearly, Jesus was the oldest son and thus responsible for his mother, which indicates that Joseph was no longer in the picture. I would like to think if Joseph was still alive that he would have been there, that he would have been willing to identify with his son. We don't know one way or the other, but it seems most likely that Joseph has died, either killed, died, whatever. He's no longer in the picture. Matt reminded me that it's also interesting that no mention of the brothers. So Jesus is there being crucified in these last moments of his consciousness. He looks over and sees his mom and sees John and decides that in these last breaths, he needs to make sure that his mother is taken care of. And we could take some time and just back out of that and just think about the life that Mary had lived. She had an illegitimate child. Any of y'all ever ask anybody how long they've been married, how old their children were, and all of a sudden did the math in your head and went, right? Probably every one of our families has got that going on. I've got that going on in my family too. You do the math and go, And so anytime anybody met Mary and Joseph and Jesus and anybody started asking any questions like we all ask, and it's been my observation, we ask the same questions all over the world. We say the same things no matter what language you speak, what culture you're in. We always say, good morning, how you doing? Did you sleep well? Is everything going okay? We all ask the very same set of questions no matter where we live in the world. And so I imagine conversations like that begin to prop up. How long have you been married? How many kids you have? How old are they? Blah, blah, blah. So Mary had lived all of her life under that shadow. And then, of course, that time Jesus and the brothers went to get Jesus because the common opinion was that he had lost his mind. And so Mary's the mother of this illegitimate son, and now Mary's the mother of this crazy man, and now Mary's the widow, and now Mary is watching her son die. So there's just so much that just comes to mind about Mary. But Jesus, again, think about that. He's hanging on a cross. The life is leaking out of him. He's about to die, and he goes, oh, let's take care of Mom. Just the writers and the readers can see pretty clearly how amazing that is. The thing I'd use to describe it, the mutual adoption of son to mother and a mother to her son. You know, adoption usually happens in infants, and the infant is unaware. In this situation, they're adults, and they are both keenly aware of the devotion and the affection that's going to grow between them. Verse 28, after this, Jesus, knowing that all was now finished, said, to fulfill Scripture, I thirst. A jar full of sour wine stood there, so they put a sponge full of the sour wine on a hyssop branch and held it to his mouth. And when Jesus had received the sour wine, he said, it is finished. And he bowed his head and gave up his spirit. This again is an additional connection to Psalm 22. There is in Psalm 22 the confession of being thirsty, and Jesus here confesses that he is thirsty. Not only, I believe, is this a connection to 22, but it's a very, very telling manifestation of the humanity of Jesus. He'd been in this traumatic situation since the upper room. They had left the supper. They had gone to the garden. He had been arrested. He's been humiliated and abused mentally and physically now for all of these hours. And he's finally hanging on the cross, and he confesses that he is thirsty. The very, very human reality. For some reason, as I was reviewing my notes this morning, I thought of the woman at the well. I thought about how that back there in John, I believe it's chapter 4, he has this interaction with the woman at the well, and there is the confession that he's thirsty and that he's tired and he's hungry, and he asks her for water. This is just how my mind works. I thought about it. At what point did the woman at the well finally get to read or hear the stories and the accounts of the crucifixion, and did she remember that moment? No point there, just vain curiosity. This jar of sour wine was different than the first offer recorded in the other Gospels, because the first drink that was offered to Jesus was intended as a type of anesthetic or numbing agent. This sour wine, as the scholars indicated, was simply the kind of wine poor people drank. It wasn't fancy. It was, you bought it at the convenience store. It had a screw lid. Some of you are remembering your teenage years. I'm not going to look at you. This sour wine was simply the kind of wine poor people would drink. No explanation why it was there, but I thought soldiers using alcohol while they waited on men to die, not too crazy, right? It was probably theirs, and they were thirsty, and so they went for it. The resources I'm using, I'm sorry, that was kind of blurred. The resources I'm using also made it pretty clear that Jesus was not likely suspended several feet off the ground as we typically see it portrayed. And if you think about it, it makes perfect sense. How would they get him? Every play, every picture you see, his feet are 6 feet off the ground. How would they have gotten him that high? Why would they have tried? And the scholars and the archaeology points to the fact that he was probably very close to the ground. That he had been lifted up, as he said he would be. He was lifted up just high enough to get his feet off the ground for them to be able to nail them into the cross. And after having read and reviewed this, I am completely convinced that they nailed him through his heels to the cross. They nailed his arms and wrists to the cross, and he was hanging there. And his height off the ground is irrelevant. The resources that I'm reading also indicated that there's a big deal made about the hyssop. I'd never read this before, but the guys that I was reading said that there's a significance about the hyssop. The hyssop was a short and flimsy thing, sort of like almost like just a little stick or a straw almost. And again, the indication is that he's just barely off the ground. just barely off the ground, his head, somewhat higher than the normal person. And so what was needed was just something to get the sponge soaked in and not touching it with their hands, and also so they could hold it to his mouth and not have to get so close that they touched his body. And it was just cheap, sour wine. It was pointed out how much of what we think about the crucifixion is driven by paintings, plays, and movies, none of which were done within hundreds of years of the actual event. The truth is, though, if we were to see the crucifixion as it really happened, it would be more clear to us why it's written in Galatians 3:13, "Cursed is everyone who is hanged on a tree." That's probably a part of it that we fail to really grasp, is just how awful and humiliating and, I don't even have another word, just absolutely humiliating it was to be publicly crucified. Again, something that we never see portrayed. He would have been naked. I don't know how many of y'all, but I'm a modest person. It's been years since I went without a t-shirt on the beach. I mean, there's just nothing about this anybody needs to see, right? Pray for Kim. I cannot imagine being paraded naked in front of everyone and then hung up there like an animal. Galatians 3:13, "Cursed is everyone who is hanged on a tree." Something else I picked up on in the reading was that crucifixion had been being used for nearly 300 years. It turns out hundreds, if not literally thousands of Jews had been crucified during the Roman occupation. Over the previous 300 years, every time there was an insurrection, anytime there was a bunch of little rebels who decided they weren't going to put up with it anymore, the Romans would come in and crush them with power and might and then crucify them. And there would be hundreds of people hanging, decomposing in the hot sun. It turns out hundreds, if not thousands, of Jews had been crucified during the Roman occupation. And as the destruction of Jerusalem approached, hundreds and thousands more would die the same way. The place where Jesus was crucified is referred to as the stone or the skull. The word Calvary is just another way of saying skull. Golgotha, skull. Somebody said it was either because it looked so much like a skull because it was just a barren dome that looks like a cranium, and then the other pock marks would have made it look like a skinless, fleshless skull. Or they said another reason it could have been called the Hill of the Skull is because of the many skulls lying around on the ground. Because it was a place of perpetual death. Just interesting. Again, the vision that we have in our mind is just so foreign to probably what it really looked like and what it really felt like, for that matter. The point for me is the religious mafia had to have hated crucifixion for the way it had been used against them through the centuries. And yet, here they were, demanding that Jesus face that terrible end. But yet, I'm reminded that it was Jesus who said, "If I be lifted up." And John said, Jesus was pointing to the cross. Verse 30. When Jesus had received the sour wine, he said, "It is finished." And he bowed his head and gave up his spirit. Two things: the declaration and the death. The declaration and the death. The declaration, "It is finished." You all have been in church long enough to know that the Greek word for it is finished is one word, and it's called tetelestai. One writer said that the word tetelestai, he put it like this, and this was a favorite saying of the Greeks, that the word tetelestai is an ocean of meaning in a drop of language. I love the poetry of that. It has an ocean of meaning in a drop of language. When I read that, it was like I could hear violins playing. That was just such an incredible thing to think about. And here's why. Because when Jesus said it was finished, he meant the journey was finished. That this lifelong journey that he had been on and all that he had been through and all that he had suffered, it was finished. The work of salvation and redemption was finished. That he had finished and did everything that would ever be needed on the part of man in order to be redeemed. It could have also meant the Old Testament sacrificial system was finished. Matthew, Mark, and Luke all mention the veil of the temple being torn away. And it revealed one of two things. It revealed, one, that there was no ark. Because the agreement is pretty widespread that the ark disappeared back when the Jews were taken into captivity under the Babylonians. That during that raid, when they came in and took all of the vessels of the temple, that they captured the ark and they took it away with them, and it was never seen again. So when you rip the veil back, you either saw A, there was no ark, or B, you realized it was not the ark. And more importantly, it was an empty ark. And so the veil being torn back is some kind of clear revelation that all they had been focused on and all they had been a part of, because also the ark was the dwelling place of God. That's where the holiness of God came down in the Exodus, and they would know the presence of God was there. It was also that place that was guarded so sacredly because you went in once a year and sprinkled blood on the mercy seat. And that's where redemption and atonement took place. And that curtain was ripped for some reason so that the common man could look in and immediately figure something out. And the ark wasn't there, or God was not there, or it was empty. But something was revealed. And the Old Testament sacrificial system was finished. An ocean of meaning in a drop of language. The declaration, it is finished. The second thing, of course, is the death. Jesus had declared that no one took his life, but he willingly laid it down. And probably no other passage makes it more clear than this one. In that moment, he willingly died. You see, it typically took from 24 to 36 hours for a person to finally die from the agony of the cross. But Jesus finished in just a few hours. He said, "It is finished," and he bowed his head and gave up his spirit. To just delve into the details one more moment. So they would beat a person within a fraction of their life. The reading I did said that there were times when that final flogging was done, that was the preparation for the crucifixion, that the men had to be careful that they did not kill the person, because they took them to such a thin line between life and death before they were crucified, and so they beat them and ripped their flesh from their body, and it was awful. But when they hung them on the cross, again, nailed, I'm gonna go with nailed through the heels, stretched out on the cross, and their body weight is hanging. So just to get as gruesome as I possibly can for a moment, they had to keep breathing. And when you are hung by your arms, it makes it incredibly difficult to breathe, not to mention the pain. In order to catch a breath, you must push up. In order to do that, you put all of your weight on your heels. And so what would happen is the person would hang there and miraculously, they would live up to 24 hours, being able to muster enough strength to lift themselves up to take another breath. But by the time of 24 to 36 hours, they would have become so dehydrated, so exposed to the elements, so succumbed to loss of blood until they no longer had the strength to pull themselves up to catch another breath, and they actually died of suffocation. Just turn to the person next to you and put your hand over their nose and mouth until they start fighting you. You want to get in a panic. Get to where you can't breathe. Any asthmatics in the room? You know what it's like to try to suck air into your lungs and can't? Has your buddy ever held you underwater until you were about to take a breath of water or air? And so the person died not being able to get another breath and died of asphyxiation. Jesus died in a few hours because he had the authority to will himself free of his life for you and me. I'll repeat what I started with. My heart's desire is that our journey through these passages would be used by the Holy Spirit to bring to full effect the power of the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ upon our lives. As I finished this up this morning and just began to review, I started scribbling. I was reminded of something that I've told y'all to do over and over, and that is to find out who you are in the story, right? I'll go ahead and let some of you off the hook. It's not very likely that you would have been one of the 4 soldiers. It's also not very likely that you would have been one of the 4 women or the 1 man. And so when you look into the story, and if you really want to try to figure out which character you are, this is probably going to not be what you expected. If you're not the soldiers, and you're not the women, and you're not John, then that really only leaves one more person. You see, we were not just the reason he was there. He is us there. We're not just the reason he is there. He is us there. And either Tim Keller or C.S. Lewis said, in order to truly understand Christ on the cross and understand what's really being portrayed there, is that one, that we would finally get a glimpse of ourselves and how awful and separated from God and deserving of death we are. And so if we're going to truly understand the cross, we have to understand that that's us. Jesus is us dying on the cross, and that's what we look like, ruined and dead and hopeless. And then the other side of that is to realize that that's how much God loves us, is that he would be willing to do that for us. And I thought, well, that sounds crazy. But then I remembered Galatians 2:20. In Galatians 2:20, Paul says, I have been crucified with Christ, period. I have been crucified with Christ. So if you want to really get the crucifixion, if you really want to get what happened on Calvary, you must see that it is you on the cross. It is Jesus as you on the cross. Not just for you, as you. I have been crucified with Christ. It is no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. And the life I now live in the flesh, I live by faith in the Son of God who loved me and gave himself for me. I am crucified with Christ. We must see ourselves in him on the cross. We must see that is us. He is us dying for our sin. That's what we deserve. That's us dying on the cross. Only the miracle is it's not us, it's him, and he's dying in our place. But here's what we have to do. If Easter and crucifixion is ever going to happen and ever be what it must be for us, we've got to go get on the cross. We have got to go identify with Christ. We've got to get to the place where we go, Jesus, you were me on the cross. And I was in you on the cross. And there must be that identification. There must be that unity, that there, and as I'm thinking about it in my own life, and the difference, the way Paul lived his life, I said, maybe what's missing in my life is I've never really, really, truly wrapped my mind around and my heart around what it would mean for Galatians 2:20 to become as real in my life as it was in Paul's life. I have been crucified with Christ. I have been crucified with Christ. Which took me to something else. Matt, which one of the cameras can you see the Post-it notes? Are we not on? Don't worry about it. Let me come back into frame. I'm going to be moving over here. So you notice on the cross, there's two of them. For those of you who can't see everything online, there are two of these, and on both of them there are a number of multicolored Post-its. And that's a leftover from Sunday night. Sunday night we had a night of worship, and as a part of that, we were instructed to take that thing with which we were battling the most or burdened with the most. We were to take a Post-it note and peel it off and actually write on the side that the sticky is on so that you could stick it anonymously to the cross. And so here you see the results. And so people were instructed and invited to write down on that Post-it note. One girl told me she had to use a whole pad. You write on that thing with which you are battling the most, that you need Jesus to crucify in your life, that you need to come to the cross. You need to be crucified with Christ because that battle in your life needs to be defeated, and only the power of the cross can do that. Or your burden for someone, a husband, a wife, a parent, a child, a cousin, a friend, a daughter, a son, whatever. You're burdened for them, and you want to see them come to know Christ or be delivered from the battle that they are in. So there are a lot of things. But it occurred to me, I wrote some things on my Post-it note. But the thing I didn't write, and I'm going to write, is my name. Because the number one thing in my life that needs to be nailed to that cross is me. So after we go off the air, off online at the end of the service, I'm going to give you a chance to, if you weren't here Sunday night, to get a Post-it note. We've got pens and Post-it notes on all of the pews, and you can go, and I want you to do this privately. It's not important that anybody else knows what you wrote and stuck there, so turn the pad over and write on the side that has the sticky and peel it off and then stick it to the cross. And at that time, I'm going to tell you the thing that I had failed to put on there that I think is the number one thing I need to put on there is I need to write my name because I need to be crucified with Christ. Because I need that to become true in my life. I have been crucified with Christ, and it is no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. And the life I now live in the flesh, I live by faith in the Son of God who loved me and gave himself for me. And I'm pretty sure if the last half of that verse is ever going to come true in my life, the first half must come true. And I must come to the place where I begin to identify my life as I am crucified with Christ. Will you pray with me? Jesus, thank you. Thank you for showing us through your word what you did for us. Thank you for men and women through the centuries have recorded and researched and done so many things to give us as much insight as we possibly can have into what happened that terrible afternoon. Help us to begin to understand what happened not only that terrible afternoon, but that wonderful afternoon when you became us. You who knew no sin became sin for us. Had we been the one dying, we would have gotten what we deserved. And we would spend eternity in hell. But in your greatness, in your divinity and your humanity, you took all that we are and all that we deserved, and you finished it. You finished it for us. And so, Jesus, help me this season, this celebration of Easter, as we move closer to that day of celebrating the resurrection. May we have come to a place where we have understood it more than we ever have before in our life. And may we come to the place where we either literally or just mentally make sure we have put our name on the cross. And that we could say with Paul, I have been crucified with Christ. Oh, Jesus, make it so in our life. Amen. So those of you who joined us online, we are grateful that you were here. And just remind you, we are going to be back here Sunday morning, live in the room and online. And I hope that you will join us here. I would like to invite you to join us here. We've been shown so much grace and protection and favor during this season. We'd like to invite you to join us. Some people wear masks, some people don't. If you want to wear your mask, please come and wear it. Don't feel just because someone else is not wearing one, don't let that stop you. Please come. We'd love to see you. We'd love to be here together. We'd love to see the house full this coming Sunday morning. But we'll see you online, if not in the room. God bless you. Have a great rest of the day.